Welcome to Interpreting Symbolism in Myth and Ritual, with special relevance to Freemasonry with me, Chuck Dunning. This presentation is one that I have given to a number of Masonic gatherings, but I've never actually written down into an essay. So for this video, I'm just going to be going through the slideshow and speaking extemporaneously. We often define Freemasonry as a peculiar system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. This points to both allegory and symbolism as central to our understanding of Freemasonry, how Freemasonry works, and what it is that we're supposed to be doing as Freemasons. And to clarify, a symbol is something that represents something else. It opens a kind of mental door to ideas or concepts or experiences that are bigger than the symbol itself. Allegories make use of symbols and the properties of symbolism to communicate much larger ideas and concepts and to provide plenty of things for our minds to reflect upon and try to make sense of in useful ways. And there's actually an academic field that specializes in working with symbolism and allegory, and it's called semiotics. That should be something that would be of interest, I think, to any Freemason who is interested in truly being speculative in the craft. Now, in the process of making interpretations, of being speculative, one of the things that I find useful is to refer to the processes of exegesis, which is scriptural interpretation. And in Judaism, they have a tradition of interpretation, of exegesis, that's called pardes. Pardes literally means garden, but it's actually used as a kind of acronym for different levels or depths of interpretation. The P standing for the Hebrew word pashat, which means the plain or simple or direct meaning of things, might even regard that as the literal meaning. Remes, which means the hints or the deeper, more allegorical, symbolic meanings that are beyond just the literal. Darash, from the Hebrew word for inquire or seek, that is a kind of comparative meaning given through similar occurrences that are used in different places in Scripture. This is also sometimes called the associative meanings. And then finally, the sod. This is the secret or mysterious meaning, and sometimes people would even say the mystical or esoteric meaning that comes directly through inspiration or revelation. And sometimes people will say sod can actually be communicated, but is only done so in secret from mouth to ear in the oral tradition. Many others would say no, sod only can happen directly, and that when it then becomes communicated by one person to another, either by word of mouth or in writing, it's no longer sod. That at that point it becomes something else for another person's level of darash exegesis. Now, the point here is that each of these levels has relevance outside of scriptural interpretation. We can look at the interpretations of what we do and what we encounter in Freemasonry through these same lenses and same methods. So, Peshat being taking things literally, Remez being those things that are beyond the literal, that are more allegorical or symbolic, and these are the kinds of things that we would encounter as the traditional interpretations that are provided to us in our ritual, those social and moral interpretations that are clearly stated in our ritual and recorded in our monitors and manuals. And Darash would then be what we find as we start looking outside of ritual and our monitors and rituals, looking for those things that show up in other traditions even, and seeing how that might illuminate some of our Masonic experience. And then finally, Sod would be the things that come to us in our contemplations, our private meditations that come to us through inspiration, intuition, and so forth. One of the things that I have noticed when I get to talking with others about symbolism is that very often it's kind of a knee-jerk or default sense that we have of symbols as visual images. And we forget that symbols can be encountered with all of our senses. Anything can be used as a symbol for something else. And thus allegories can involve all sorts of different symbols and ways of exercising symbolism, and you see some of them listed here. So the very settings in which we meet, the objects we encounter there, numbers, actions, and words, everything that is part of ritual conducted in a Masonic space can be regarded and should be regarded as a symbol, and therefore open to interpretation at all these different levels that we've been talking about. So, how can we, in our speculations, our interpretations, begin to go beyond the literal and beyond the allegorical meanings that are provided to us in our ritual, in our monitors and manuals? Where can we look for that beginning of the Darash uh, level of interpretation, where we start trying to see associations and correlations? Well, obviously here I'm pointing toward heraldry as one of the places where we might find more meaning, because in the art of heraldry, there are long ancient traditions of specific symbols having certain meanings that are communicated through family crests or through the crests of organizations, institutions, and so on. And those can often shed light that we might find very meaningful and useful for a deeper appreciation of the symbols that we find in Freemasonry. Similarly, we can look to color theory. Now, what I have on the screen here is one example of color theory, but there are others. And so colors can mean different things or be thought to represent different things in different traditions and different schools and by different authorities. But we can pick one of those as a starting place and use that as a way of unfolding more possibilities in our interpretations and speculations on Masonic symbols and allegories. Similarly, number symbolism is something that we find many different versions of. And here I have included two that have some resonance with the Pythagorean tradition, for example. We find numbers showing up all over the place in Masonic ritual and symbolism. And that naturally leads us to sacred geometry. And there's a lot of literature that appeared, particularly in the 20th century, on sacred geometry and on what um, different geometric forms and shapes might represent and how they might be related to each other. And you see on the right side of this image um, a famous depiction of the Pythagorean theorem with a kind of Egyptian overlay, showing a relationship between Horus and Horus's parents, Isis and Osiris. Uh, this is also um, often regarded as speaking of the relationship between the divine, between nature, and the human soul. So sacred geometry is one of those ways in which number becomes a little bit more concrete in terms of things that it can represent and suggest. And there are obviously plenty of opportunities for that in Freemasonry. Now, talking about these different ways of looking at symbols, and especially when we get into numbers and geometric shapes, it naturally leads us into the idea of archetypes. And the word archetype literally means a first form or a principal form. And this idea about archetypes, well, we often think of Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychologist who talked about the archetypes of the unconscious as these forms of or patterns of human thought and behavior that tend to show up across cultures and throughout time are fairly universal, manifesting from one individual to another in different ways. But the idea of archetypes goes back much further than him. Plato talked about these quite a bit, and his view was that the archetypes are the essential kind of patterns or building blocks that are inherent in creation, in reality itself, and then emerge in all of these different ways in manifested things, in created things. That they are the fundamental patterns that interconnect with each other to give rise to these specific things in the physical world. For him, the archetypes are more real because they are eternal and they don't change um, as compared to things in the material world that are constantly changing and that eventually are destroyed and disappear. Now, when we think of archetypes in a way that we can grasp and make use of in Freemasonry, archetypes that are relevant to our lives in the world as individuals and also in our relationships and in the experiences of societies as a whole, then we start looking for universal patterns. And one of the most common ways that we see this across all cultures and times is in looking to the stars, looking to the constellations in particular for images that speak to us symbolically, allegorically about these universal things, these universal truths that we can find at work behind the scenes of our experiences. And so we naturally find Freemasons using astrology and as a way of understanding Masonic symbolism and Masonic allegory at a deeper, more universal level. A really good example of that is the book Stellar Theology and Masonic Astronomy, I believe is the title of it, and I think the author's name is Hewitt Brown. So that's another way to begin to gain deeper insight, um, deeper interpretations and speculations on the meaning of what we're doing in Freemasonry. Many religious traditions, particularly in their mystical or esoteric branches, try to develop symbol sets that represent these archetypes, that provide ways of categorizing and organizing these archetypes in meaningful ways, that then can be applied in deciphering or bringing more meaning to uh, different symbols and allegories that we might occur in ritual or in scripture. And a prime example of this is the Kabbalah and its tree of life, which you see here on the screen, showing these 10 spheres that each represent one of the principles or intelligences that are involved in the movement of emanation from the source all the way down through the different planes of manifestation into the physical world at the very bottom. And and each one of these 10 spheres, called sephirot, shown on the tree of life, is sometimes referred to as kind of like a drawer in a filing cabinet, where you can begin to place other things that naturally become associated for you with each of these 10 principles. For example, we might look at the sphere number 7, which on the screen there is the green one to the lower right. That's the sphere Netzach, which means victory, and it very early on was associated with the planet Venus in the Kabbalistic tradition. And so from there we begin to make other associations, because we know that Venus is associated with love in all of its forms, even though we tend to particularly speak of it in terms of romantic love. Um, but then other associations begin to arise, and they get filed in that container of Netzach for us. We're kind of using it as a kind of memory palace in a sense. And so this can then become a way of making more sense, finding more associations and meanings in that darash level of the Pardes form of exegesis, that we find something in Freemasonry that resonates with something that is found in that seventh Sephirah, and then we can begin to speculate on how the other things associated with that seventh Sephirah might be relevant to whatever it was that we found in Freemasonry. There's been a lot of work done in the interpretation of mythology, and with that, the different kinds of characters that tend to show up in different myths. And on the slide that is now apparent here, you see these different characters that can show up. And these actually represent different types of human personalities. And and because our rituals involve different roles among the officers, as well as different characters in the stories that we act out, we can begin to make interpretations based upon the associations that we find with different characters in the stories of myth. Um, there's lots of depth there, and this certainly gets closer into what Carl Jung would have to offer with his archetypes of the collective unconscious. And on that note, we can also draw lots of possibilities from the work of the mythologist Joseph Campbell, who's probably best known for his theory of the hero's journey and how this cycle that he sees playing out in all of the great stories of humanity can be used as a way of, of looking at any myth, at any great story, and seeing what the universal messages might be there that would be applicable in any time and place, but in unique ways depending upon who the individuals are and the culture that it's happening in. So I know a number of Freemasons who have been using Joseph Campbell's myth interpretation, the hero's journey, with significant effect, particularly with regard to the story of Hiram Abiff and with the things that we find in other rites, such as the Scottish Rite and the York Rite. So here's just a reminder of those different levels of interpretation and speculation. And once again, you can see that we've largely been talking about this level that's associated with the letter D for Darash. The comparative meanings, looking into how our symbols might connect, might parallel or intersect with the way similar symbols or maybe even identical symbols are used in other contexts. But we haven't really quite addressed the final level, Sod, yet. And you'll remember that we've talked about this as being one that is the result of, a direct apprehension through intuition, through inspiration. Well, that's not something that you're going to get through the process of association. Association might stimulate it. It might provide a fertile soil in which something like that can take root and then flower and blossom. But you've got to exercise a different faculty of consciousness in order for this sort of thing to arise. In fact, you have to be willing and able to pass through the veils of ordinary mental functions, of ordinary intellectual operations for this sort of thing to happen. And this is one of the reasons why I am such an advocate for contemplative practice, because contemplative practice makes it possible for us to create a kind of open space within consciousness, a space less disturbed by the other ways that we tend to use our minds, a space where the sparks of insight and intuition, inspiration and creativity can come to us, and that we can then unfold, or that we can plant like seeds into the other contents of our consciousness and see them then flower and blossom into something more recognizable and meaningful. Anyone who has had this experience of a sudden insight that you haven't quite generated through a very linear process of logical reasoning, but that may have kind of leapt in out of nowhere on top of a process of reasoning, sometimes filling that space where we have encountered a sense of uncertainty or just not knowing, where am I going to go now? My thought doesn't seem to be leading to a conclusion or to the understanding that I'm searching for. And a kind of question mark just arises within us. And for a moment we pause, and then all of a sudden, boom, there it is. There's something that is beginning to unfold, and and we may even be trying to share it with others as it's happening, and we're struggling to find the words for it, or we're trying to write it down and struggling to find the words for it. Most people know what that experience is like, and that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here, but perhaps at a more intentional and deeper level. So, how can you do that more intentionally, more consistently? How can you open yourself to receive those sorts of meanings? Well, one of the projects that I've been involved with in my Masonic career is the Masonic Legacy Society. And you can see here their URL, Masonic Legacy Society 2026.com. This is a fantastic offering for the use of contemplative methods in Masonic education. Now, this Masonic education can be just, one educating oneself, or these things can also be applied in the way that we do education as a group. And I'm going to give you more information about that. If you go to that website, one of the things that you can download is this document, often referred to as the document, called Practicing the Art of Our Mysteries. And in this document, it outlines a very straightforward and reliable means of practicing contemplation on Masonic symbolism. Now, this process is guided by this threefold intention that the Masonic Legacy Society has encoded. And I'm going to go ahead and read these off because I think that this is really important to know where this is all coming from. What are the motivations and intentions? One, to better enable brothers to draw their own transformative knowledge from the deep well of Freemasonry and not merely accept the interpretations of their predecessors. Now, I just want to note that the phrasing here is not merely accept. We're not saying that we must reject the interpretations of our predecessors, but let's build upon them. Let's expand them. Let's make them more relevant. Point number two, to encourage brothers to remain committed to Freemasonry without directing them to traditions beyond the craft. Now, this is an important point because a lot of times what we see when people are trying to offer different interpretations of Masonic symbolism from those that are found in our ritual and our monitors and manuals is they point to some tradition like Kabbalah, for example, and say, well, that's where the real deep meanings are found. And so if you're going to become the best Freemason you can be, well, then you really have to become a Kabbalist. And you need to be putting all your time and energy into that. And the position of the Masonic Legacy Society is that while that might be a good idea for some individuals to make blanket statements like that across the board for all Freemasons is misguided and it's misleading, that is not necessary. Um, we can draw from other traditions without having to immerse ourselves in them and in a way, make Freemasonry a kind of substitute or veneer over another tradition that we should really be digging into more deeply. Okay, point number three. To awaken the ability of Freemasonry to make profoundly meaningful differences in the world at large. In other words, this intention is about practical benefit. That Freemasonry should be, and its ritual tells us clearly that it is about making real changes in our lives as individuals that then have an effect on our relationships and the world around us. We're not just playing intellectual games in Freemasonry, or at least we shouldn't be, although from time to time it's easy enough to find ourselves doing that. So, further statements here about the intentions and aims of the Masonic Legacy Society and some guidelines for how to proceed with what it offers. Accept not knowing. Be curious. Embrace mystery. In other words, start off with the recognition that we don't have all the answers. We don't have all the meanings. The ritual itself does not provide us with all of the meanings that can be found. In fact, many of our rituals encourage us to continue the work of speculation and interpretation, not to just be content with what's provided by the ritual itself. Now, it really helps if we're curious, if we allow ourselves to enjoy that process of discovery and to have that exciting sense that there's something else just over the horizon, or there's another door to be opened, another set of veils to be parted. And this sense of mystery, of recognizing that there's so much more to our existence than we're ever fully aware of, and that is something to be embraced, not turned away from, not shied from, not seen as threatening or frightening in any way, but something that is wonderful. Continuing on with the quote, along your journey you may find that it is useful to supplant your personal knowledge with that of other seekers. Bear in mind, however, that one's own insights, no matter how significant they may seem, do not necessarily translate into either A, secret or hidden meanings consciously intended by the originating ritualists, or B, meanings that others should find equally significant for themselves. Each must find one's own meaning. End quote. One of the reasons I think it's important to keep all of this in mind is because we can get so excited about our discoveries and so convinced of their truth and their wisdom and their beauty that we can find ourselves communicating them to others as if, look, this is what our symbol really means. This is what our allegories are really about. And if you don't see this, well, then you just don't get it. That mistake can be really easy to make. And I'll be the first to say I've done it more times than I can count. Um, but let's keep in mind that these things have to be relative to us as individuals. That each of us leads a somewhat different life. And even though there are universal principles and archetypes at work behind the scenes of our lives, they are intersecting with each other within our lives in ways that are very unique and different. And we need to respect that and respect each other's responsibility and right to find different meanings. Now, getting back to those universal patterns or principles that can help us make sense of things, one of the things the Masonic Legacy Society does is point to one of the most basic patterns, and that is we can all see our being as composed of four elements or aspects: the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, and the spiritual. And therefore, when we begin trying to make more sense, more meaning of our Masonic experience, we should begin looking at how each of these elements or aspects is engaged by or commented upon by our ritual and what we read in our monitors and manuals. If we break that down further, when we're talking about the physical, we're talking about our bodies and our sensations. And we talk about the five senses. And although there are actually more than five physical senses, we highlight five within our ritual. And then, of course, what we do with our bodies, the actions that happen in our rituals or that are spoken about in our rituals. Then at the emotional level, we're talking about our feelings, desires, and passions, and certainly Masonry says a lot about those things. And we actually have different feelings and desires and different passions that we find ourselves connecting with in our Masonic experiences. At the intellectual level, we're talking about ideas, questions, the use of our imaginations. And at the spiritual level, intuition, inspiration, and creativity, and certainly the symbolism of a society of builders, of architects and builders, connects with the idea of creativity. And in particular, I would just note that in our tradition, we talk about Hiram Abiff uh, going into prayer to receive inspiration for the designs that he would draw on the trestle board for the craft. Another pattern that the Masonic Legacy Society finds in Masonic ritual is three layers of meaning that are relevant to but also transcend the individual. They begin with the individual in what we might call the internal lodge. And so that's your own psyche, your own life. And we've seen that it has these four aspects that we just reviewed. And then there's the external lodge. And what we're talking about there is the other members of a Masonic lodge or other Masonic organization that you interact with, that you do Masonic things with. And then finally, the Universal Lodge, which is everyone and everything. So again, you are the internal lodge, and everything that we experience in Freemasonry, the lodge room itself, all of the characters, all of the symbols and stations and places and furnishings and jewels of the lodge, all represent something about you. And so that is the first level of deep interpretation that we're encouraging people to work with in this process. And the external lodge is all of those things that we've been talking about, all of the furnishings and stations and places and so forth of the lodge. And it's also the brethren who are gathered there. More importantly, it is the brethren who are gathered there. And so we begin to see how those aspects of the internal lodge begin to extend outwardly and intersect with each other, how they interact and connect with each other, and what human relationships look like when they are following those patterns that are highlighted for us by Masonic ritual. That's the external lodge. And as we continue to extend those patterns out even further, we see them operating in the cosmos as a whole. And we see the potential for all of humanity to join in the same patterns, and thus a responsibility for us as brothers in the external lodge, and then for us as individuals in our internal lodges, for rooting those principles in our own lives so that we can then carry them out more effectively into all of our relationships and interactions with other people and other beings and things in the universe as a whole. Now, I've been referring to this process of contemplative interpretation, of opening ourselves to deeper meanings, of finding different ways of working at this level of Darash and then Sod. And so now we're going to get into the actual methods that the Masonic Legacy Society offers. First is to begin with a process of relaxation, of actually sitting down, being quiet and still, relaxing, breathing peacefully, and being quiet. A lot of people will tend to skip over this or not give it as much time and attention as it is due. We are so used to working in a way that means jumping immediately into problem solving processes or um, constructive processes of one thing or another, rather than really relaxing and clearing our minds of things, clearing away all kinds of distraction. And uh, and if we don't give this part of the process due attention, then the others will definitely suffer for it, and we'll miss out, maybe without even realizing it, on the depths that would have been available to us. The second step is prayer. I mean, we are taught in Freemasonry to invoke the aid of deity before we get started on any worthwhile endeavor. And so this is something that after you've become relaxed or in the process of your relaxation, offering a prayer, asking for the assistance of the divine in whatever way is meaningful to you as an individual is something that as a Mason you should be practicing. And once you are sufficiently relaxed and you have offered your prayer of invocation, then we move into the phase of meditation. And this is where we bring that element of our ritual to mind and make it the center and focus of our attention for some period of times while we sit silently. And you'll notice here that the language is giving your heart and mind an opportunity to intuitively respond. What we're meaning here is that we're not just looking for intellectual, philosophical kinds of insights and inspirations. Allow yourself to be touched by a symbol for meaning to unfold that may be more than abstract, but actually is significant in terms of love and compassion and feeling that sense of connectedness and bonding with others. And after having sat silently with this symbol or allegory at the center of your consciousness and allowing things to arise around it, then you can begin to speculate about what these different things may be unfolding in meaning of the symbol or allegory. So you would come out of the meditation, open your eyes, and take some time to like actually make notes. This is really important because people underestimate the significance of actually writing down even just brief little phrases or words as reminders of things that came to you during meditation. Doing that can help connections begin to emerge that weren't apparent to you as that first little spark of insight, intuition, inspiration came to you. And as you do this, as you go through this process, we encourage you to keep in mind those four aspects of your being: physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual, and the three lodges, and trying to see how these different things that you may have encountered in meditation around the symbol, the chosen symbol, may be relevant to those two different categories of speculation. Finally, just as writing things down is important, it's also vitally important to talk about things with others. Now, these discussions should be with people that you trust, and they're certainly better when you engage with people that are trying to do similar work. Um, and I'll bet it's not uncommon for you to have experienced how insight becomes clearer when you are talking things out with someone else. Even if you have written an essay in which you've very carefully examined something, if you just talk that through then with someone else, how often is it that you have noticed new insights or maybe even a sharper sense of clarity about something emerges in the process? Not only that, you may be sharing something that the other person or persons will find stimulating in ways that would have never otherwise occurred to them. So this is a really important step. And you'll notice this is where things bridge from the internal lodge to the external lodge, making it possible then to go into the universal lodge. Okay, that's all I'm going to do for this particular presentation. I hope that you found it useful. Um, if you want more information, of course, you can always come back to the Contemplative Builder YouTube channel, and I do strongly encourage you to visit the Masonic Legacy Society's website at MasonicLegacySociety2026.com. Wonderful resources there, more than what I just shared with you, and I think you'll find it well worth your time. Thank you.